much importance should a writer place on dialogue?
A lot and a little. A lot, but not as much as most people do, I guess, is the correct answer. In the grand scheme of things, dialogue is the least important part of screenwriting. It's the least important part of the movie. Obviously, there are dialogue-heavy movies that, All About Eve or something, where that may not be the case. But even then, structure is much more important. Story, character, scene, and then lastly, the actual specific dialogue. If a scene and a story and the characters are well thought through and well structured, the dialogue will almost seem to write itself, and it should. So if you're laboring over the dialogue, stop, because the problem is not with the dialogue, the problem is with something earlier. You haven't set up the story properly. The character isn't rich enough, or the scene has no purpose, or the story doesn't seem to know where it wants to go and you've lost the thread of it. That's why the dialogue is difficult to write. Writing great dialogue is great fun, and there are people who are really good at it and people who aren't so good at it. Obviously, somebody like Aaron Sorkin, that's his stock and trade, and he's great at it. And there's I do a whole section about dialogue, and because it's so much fun to do, and there's a lot to learn about how to write dialogue. But its place in the pie chart should be a fairly small sliver. There are great movies that don't have much dialogue at all. And there are great movies that have dialogue, but it isn't particularly terrific dialogue. It's not what cinema does best. Stage is a better place if you just want to write dialogue. The live theater is probably a better place for you to be. I could pick up the phone right now if I needed to and call 10 people who are great joke writers and dialogue writers, and they would come in, and if they were getting paid, they'd show up in a minute, and they'd be happy to write some of the greatest dialogue you could possibly think up. That's the easy part. That's the fun part. It's the structural part that has to be done. The other steps, the structure, the scene structure, and the characters have to be in place first. It's always a temptation for most writers to jump to the dialogue too fast because it's fun and they just want to get to it. It's so much more fun to write for most writers than structuring out their story. I happen to like structure, so it doesn't bother me, but for a lot of writers, they just want to get to the dialogue quicker. Dialogue is music with the melody removed. Dialogue is writing lyrics. In essence, it has a musical quality when it's done well, and that the sound and the meter of the dialogue is functioning is just as important as the actual meaning of the words. The words you choose and the order you choose to put them in the actors' mouths is just as important in terms of their sound and their meter as it is in terms of the actual technical dictionary definition of the words. Because what you're trying to communicate to the audience is the emotion of the scene. It's not about delivering technical information. Dialogue's not particularly good at that. You can have characters talk about stuff that's technical, and the audience just goes in one ear and out the other because the audience isn't interested. They're just focused on the emotion of the story. So time spent trying to deliver exposition through dialogue is mostly time wasted. Obviously, some of it is necessary. Sometimes it's the only way to communicate things is through dialogue. Technical things, information that they need to know, but it's not the most effective way. I used to say, like sometimes when I was teaching, I'd say, okay, probably everybody's seen Ocean's 11. Yeah, I've seen Ocean's 11. I'd say, well, what's Brad Pitt's name? What? Nobody can remember. Because it's, maybe if you've seen it over and over and over and you love the movie, you remember, but it's probably said, who knows, 30 times in the movie, nobody remembers. It doesn't matter. It's not important. We're not focused on that. So that kind of technical stuff and anything scientific or technical that's in dialogue, the audience doesn't even hear it. They just hear blah, 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 blah.
But a name like Kaiser Sose, we're going to remember because
the story hinges on that. And of course it was repeated many times and it's a distinctive name, but it also had a meaning. We had an emotional investment in who is Kaiser Sose.
How do you work with your students on dialogue?
Well, you do it by saying it aloud, because again, it's music. So it'd be like trying to teach. It's the hardest part to teach, because it's like teaching music. Some people have an ear and some people don't. You can you can help people, guide people to do it better. But I usually show a lot of clips, and I show clips from different great dialogue writers. Sometimes people that haven't younger students don't know of or haven't seen the films. So I'll show them, of course, Aaron Sorkin scenes. I show them a lot of Patty Chayefsky scenes. He writes dialogue in a very different way. Robert Bolt was a great dialogue writer with a lot of techniques you can use. But because it's music, it would be like trying to teach music without ever having heard, music played. How do you describe it? And I do exercises with them to take a line that's, especially in comedy, a line that doesn't seem particularly funny and find a way to say it so it is, or a line that isn't as funny as it ought to be, but you can say it so it is. I used to use it as an example, a line from Hamlet, of all things. And there's a line in Act 1 where Horatio's come to visit Hamlet, whose mother has just gotten remarried soon after his father died. And his friend Horatio comes to see him. And Hamlet says something to the effect of, he says, "Oh, you're here. Why did you come here?" And Horatio says, "Oh, I came for your father's funeral." And Hamlet says, "No, I think you came for my mother's wedding." And Horatio says, "Indeed, my lord, it followed hard upon." And Hamlet says, thrift, Horatio, the funeral meats did coldly furnish forth the wedding table." Now that's a great joke in Elizabethan England, but the wording is designed for an Elizabethan audience. So Elizabethan audiences roll on the floor with that line. We have to take a moment and decipher it, because the dialogue, the rhythm and the meter is alien to our ear. We have to actually decipher it. They didn't have to. So we would do an exercise. We would then take that line and the meaning of the line, thrift, Horatio, the funeral meats did coldly furnish forth the wedding table. What he meant was, in modern language, they were just trying to save money. They could reuse the same deli platter. Now that's the way we would say it to a modern audience. The guts of the joke are the same, but the dialogue would have to change for a modern ear to hear it and understand what it meant and possibly even laugh at it. It's all about the sound and the meter, as much as the meaning of the words themselves.
Whereas something like Howard's End, I think it was enough where all audiences could figure out the meaning of certain things. It wasn't so sort of far out. I think it was around the 1800s. The movie was supposed to take place.
Howard's End, I believe, is around the turn of the century.
Okay.
I believe.
Okay.
Maybe a little before that. Yeah, that's about the outside edge where English is still. Where you could honor the actual sound of the way English was spoken and expect a modern audience to understand it without a little help. Otherwise, you have to start cheating a little bit. You're always writing for a contemporary audience. You're always writing for the audience that exists now. You're not, even if you set something in, Elizabethan England, you don't write it for an Elizabethan audience. You have to write it for now. And so it means you have to choose your words carefully and adjust them slightly. You're not going to use some of the more arcane words and references that a modern ear wouldn't hear. It's interesting, when Kenneth Branagh made Hamlet it was about 20 years ago now, I guess. And he chose to set it in the 1800s, even though Hamlet itself was written in the early 1600s and set long before that. But he set it in that time because he thought that was the closest he could get to modern times and still have that arcane language sound like it made sense coming out of people's mouths because of the costumes they were wearing and the way the world looked. That stylized Shakespearean language sounded okay to his mind. It made sense that people might speak that way in 1880, even though they didn't. He was cheating a bit. But everybody has their own ways. A lot of times Shakespeare is set just against in a fictional, non-specific time period because of that as well. They didn't want to They want it to look like Elizabethan England. They want it to look like it could happen anywhere, anytime. And sometimes it works. They did a version of Richard III that way with Ian McClellan years ago that was set in a sort of a fictional World War II-ish era, but they were using the Shakespearean language, of course. And it sort of worked.